Number 1. The Cladh Hallan composite mummies. Picture yourself on a low, wind-scoured island of the Outer Hebrides in the year 1100 BC. The Atlantic crashes against pale gray rock to the west. Smoke from a peat fire curls under the thatched roof of a roundhouse. Somewhere beneath your feet, in a shallow pit dug into the floor of that same house, lies the body of an ancestor who has been dead for more than 3 centuries. The body is mostly intact, the skin is leathery, the face is recognizable, and the body is not, in any meaningful sense, one person. In 1988, a young archaeologist named Mike Parker Pearson began excavating a settlement at Cladh Hallan on the island of South Uist. The work continued through 2002. Beneath 3 Bronze Age roundhouses, his team found 4 bodies, all curled into tight fetal positions. 2 of those bodies, a man and a woman, would change everything we thought we knew about prehistoric Britain. The bodies had been mummified. That alone was startling, because mummification was not supposed to exist in Bronze Age Britain. The technique was unique. The corpses had been immersed in a peat bog for somewhere between 6 and 18 months, long enough for the acidic, oxygen-starved water to halt bacterial decay, but not so long that the bone became brittle. They had then been removed and kept above ground in a halted state of preservation for between 300 and 600 years before being buried beneath the floor. In 2012, a geneticist named Terry Brown of the University of Manchester published the result that no one expected. He had run ancient DNA analysis on the bodies. The male was not one man. He was 3. The skull belonged to one individual, the torso belonged to another, the lower jaw belonged to a third. They had been articulated together with sinew bindings and arranged into a single coherent skeleton. The female was the same. Her skull was centuries older than the rest of her body. The strontium isotopes in the teeth indicated at least one of the donor individuals had grown up far inland, well outside the Hebrides. 3 theories now compete to explain Cladh Hallan. Parker Pearson argues these were composite ancestors, deliberately merged to symbolize the joining of kin lines. Janet Montgomery of Durham University suggests the practice was a substitute, used to complete bodies whose original parts had been lost. A third, more speculative interpretation holds that the composites were ritual chimeras, designed to merge spiritual lineages into a single supernatural authority. 6 more candidate composite skeletons have since been identified across the British Isles. Cladh Hallan is no longer an outlier. It is the founding evidence for an entire forgotten practice. Number 2. The Herxheim cannibalism pits. The smell would have reached you before the site did. In the year 5000 BC, on the loess-covered uplands of what is now the Rhineland-Palatinate region of southwestern Germany, 2 concentric ditches were dug into the soft yellow soil. Inside those ditches, over a period of roughly 50 years, the remains of more than 1,000 human beings were systematically processed. Discovery came in 1996 during construction work near the modern village of Herxheim. The full investigation was conducted by Andrea Zeeb-Lans of the Rhineland-Palatinate Cultural Heritage Office, with bone analysis led by Bruno Boulestin of the University of Bordeaux. What they uncovered between 2005 and 2008 has no parallel in European prehistory. The victims were men, women, and children, with a slight overrepresentation of children under 12. The cut marks on their bones were not random. They were identical, in placement, depth, and angle, to butchery cut marks found on cattle carcasses from the same period. Long bones had been split lengthwise to access the marrow. Skulls had been carefully cut around the brow ridge to remove the cranial vault and access the brain. More than 217 skull caps had been further worked into smoothed, standardized skull cups. Strontium isotope analysis by Robert Hedges of Oxford showed that many of the victims had grown up hundreds of kilometers from Herxheim. They were not locals. The pottery sherds in the pits represented multiple linear pottery culture styles drawn from across Central Europe. Whoever was killing them on an industrial scale and drawing them from an enormous geographical catchment. None of the bones show evidence of pre-mortem violence. The killing was done elsewhere, cleanly, probably with a single blow. The processing happened at Herxheim. 3 theories now compete. Boulestin argues this was ritualized cannibalism taking place during the final cultural collapse of the linear pottery culture. Zeeb-Lans argues it was secondary ancestor burial with ritual defleshing rather than consumption. Detlef Gronenborn of the Roman Germanic Central Museum in Mainz argues for a third reading: apocalyptic sacrifice to gods who were perceived to have abandoned their people. Within 2 human generations of Herxheim, the entire linear pottery culture vanished from the archaeological record. There is no mass migration to explain it, no plague signature, no successor culture inheriting the territory. Whatever was happening at Herxheim was happening at the very end of Central Europe's first farming experiment. The largest organized cannibalism site in European prehistory sits at exactly the moment a civilization went silent. Number 3. The Pampa la Cruz sacrifice site. On a windblown stretch of Pacific coastline just north of the modern Peruvian city of Trujillo, the wet clay still holds the footprints of children walking toward their deaths. In 2018, an archaeologist named Gabriel Prieto announced the discovery of a Chimu site called Huanchaquito Las Llamas. He and his team had recovered the remains of 140 children and 200 llamas, all sacrificed in a single event. By 2019, a second and even larger site had been confirmed at nearby Pampa la Cruz. By 2024, the Pampa la Cruz total had passed 269 child victims, with new excavations still uncovering more. Combined, the 2 sites represent the largest mass child sacrifice ever documented anywhere on Earth. The victims range in age from 5 to 14, with a peak between 8 and 12. Boys and girls are present in nearly equal numbers. Every child shows the same forensic signature, a clean transverse cut across the sternum, severing the ribcage and exposing the heart cavity. John Verenu of Tulane University, the leading forensic archaeologist on the project, has confirmed that the hearts were physically removed in most cases. Many of the children's faces had been marked with a single horizontal stripe of brilliant red cinnabar, a sacred mineral pigment imported from the Andean highlands hundreds of kilometers inland. The wet clay surrounding the burial pits preserved their footprints. They walked to the site themselves. They were not carried. The footprints led in a single direction with no return tracks. Strontium and oxygen isotope analysis by Andrew Somerville of Iowa State University demonstrated that the victims came from across the entire Chimu Empire, not just from Trujillo. Sediment evidence from the burial layer indicates the sacrifices coincided with a major El Nino flooding event around the year 1450 AD. The Chimu capital of Chanchan, the largest adobe city in the Americas, lay only 6 kilometers inland. The sacrifices were performed within sight of the empire's political and religious center. 3 theories now compete. Prieto argues the killings were a one-time emergency response, an attempt to halt catastrophic rains by appeasing an angry sea god. Veronu argues the practice was a routine intercessory offering, simply scaled up to match an extreme crisis. A more speculative third reading frames the event as internal political theater, a public spectacle by the Chimu elite to consolidate authority during a moment of state weakness. Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century described Chimu human sacrifice, but recorded numbers in the dozens. Pampa la Cruz proves the actual scale was an order of magnitude larger. Number 4. The screaming mummy known as Unknown Man E. In 1881, on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, French archaeologists were following a tip from local villagers. The Abd el-Rasul brothers had been quietly selling royal antiquities on the open market for nearly a decade. The trail led to a hidden cliff tomb designated DB 320, where 21st dynasty priests had relocated dozens of royal mummies for safekeeping. Among the bodies of Rameses II, Seti I, and Thutmose III, the archaeologists found something that did not belong. A man wrapped not in fine linen, but in coarse, mottled goatskin, a material the ancient Egyptians considered ritually unclean, equivalent to denying him the afterlife entirely. His mouth was gaping open, frozen in what looked like a scream. His hands and feet were tightly bound with leather straps. His body bore no embalming incision. No name had been written on the wrappings. He was catalogued as Unknown Man E. The screaming face haunted 19th century Egyptology for more than 100 years. Modern forensic analysis conducted by Sahar Salim of Cairo University using high-resolution CT scans between 2008 and 2012 finally explained that scream. The open mouth was not the mark of being buried alive. It was post-mortem jaw relaxation, made permanent because the priests had failed to bind it shut. The tongue had been caught between the teeth, consistent with violent death by hanging or strangulation. DNA testing by the Egyptian Mummy Project under Zahi Hawass identified him as a son of Pharaoh Rameses III. Almost certainly, this was Prince Pentawere. Pentawere is named in the judicial papyrus of Turin as the leader of the so-called Harem conspiracy of the year 1155 BC. The conspiracy, organized by Pentawere's mother, Tie, succeeded. Rameses III was killed by a deep cut to the throat, a wound that Selim confirmed in 2012 by CT scanning the king's own mummy. Pentawere was put on trial, convicted, and according to the court documents, allowed to take his own life. Three theories now compete. Selim argues that the unique features of his burial, the goatskin wrapping, the bound limbs, the absence of name, the unusual resin, were a deliberate damnation designed to prevent his soul from finding its way to the afterlife. Hawass argues for a less malevolent reading. The priests were operating under political duress, performed an emergency mummification, and hid him among the cash because they could not bear to discard a king's son entirely. A more speculative interpretation suggests unknown man E is not Pentawere at all, but a co-conspirator misidentified by modern DNA tests against an incomplete reference set. The evidence currently favors Selim. Number 5, the Templo Mayor skull tower. Beneath the central plaza of modern Mexico City, beneath 600 years of Spanish colonial overlay and 20th century pavement, lies a cylindrical tower of human skulls. The Aztecs called it the Huitzilopochtli, the Great Skull Rack. Construction began under the king Ahuitzotl in approximately 1486 AD and continued under Moctezuma II through 1502 AD. Ground-penetrating radar first detected the structure in 2015. Excavation began in earnest in 2017. Lead investigators Raul Barrera Rodriguez and Lorena Vasquez-Valin of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History have, as of 2024, recovered the skulls of more than 650 individuals from the tower alone, with hundreds more from the adjacent rectangular racks where additional skulls had been strung horizontally on wooden poles. The construction is precise. The tower is a circular drum roughly 5 meters in diameter, with a hollow vertical core surrounded by concentric rings of skulls cemented together with lime mortar. Each skull was processed before placement. The flesh removed, the brain extracted, the cranium cleaned and bored at the temples for stringing. When the Spanish officer Andrés de Tapia rode into Tenochtitlan in 1521 with Hernán Cortés, he described seeing skull racks containing approximately 136,000 skulls. Historians dismiss the number as exaggerated propaganda for nearly 5 centuries. The current excavation suggests Tapia's order of magnitude may have been roughly correct. The bigger surprise comes from the demographics. Aztec state ideology framed the Tzompantli as a monument of male warrior sacrifice. The recovered demographic profile is approximately 75% adult male, 20% women, and 5% children. The presence of women and children directly contradicts 500 years of received understanding. Strontium isotope analysis on a sample of 35 skulls, published in 2018, demonstrated that victims came from across Mesoamerica, raised in regions including modern Oaxaca, the Gulf Coast, and Toluca. 3 theories now compete. The mainstream interpretation, advanced by the Dean of Aztec Archaeology Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, frames the tower as cosmic political theater, a permanent ritual reminder that human blood sustained the rising of the sun, god Huitzilopochtli. Vasquez-Valin argues for a more administrative function, with the Tzompantli serving as a record-keeping monument cataloging the empire's military reach. A third, more speculative reading proposes that the late-period skulls include victims of the Coccolistli epidemics, framed retroactively as sacrifice in colonial-era chronicles. Whatever the truth, the Huitzilopochtli still extends beyond the currently exposed 5 meters. The tower, even now, is not yet fully revealed. Number 6. Roopkund Skeleton Lake. At an elevation of 5,029 meters in the Garhwal Himalayas of northern India sits a glacial tarn 40 meters across and only 2 meters deep. For most of the year, it is frozen. For a few weeks each summer, the ice retreats and reveals the dead. They are everywhere. Skulls, ribs, femurs scattered along the rocky shore and floating in the shallow turquoise water. The total population is estimated at between 600 and 800 individuals. The lake was first reported to authorities in 1942 by a forest ranger named H.K. Madhwal. Initial wartime suspicions assumed Japanese soldiers attempting an invasion of India through the Himalayas. Carbon dating quickly disproved this. For the next 60 years, the assumption was that all the bodies represented a single mass death event around the year 850 AD. In 2019, a major ancient DNA study led by Niraj Ray of the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad and Ida Wanharni of Harvard University, overturned that assumption entirely. The skeletons represent at least 3 genetically distinct populations, dying centuries apart. Group 1 consists of South Asian individuals dating from roughly 800 to 1000 AD, genetically consistent with populations of the Indian subcontinent. Group 2 consists of Eastern Mediterranean individuals closely related to modern Greeks and Cretans, dating from approximately 1700 to 1850 AD. Group 3 consists of a single Southeast Asian individual, also from around 1800 AD. The Mediterranean DNA component remains entirely unexplained. There is no historical record of any European pilgrimage or expedition reaching Roopkund. The skulls themselves point to a probable cause of death. Many show short, round depression fractures, roughly 6 to 8 centimeters, across, located on the back of the head and shoulders. The wound pattern is inconsistent with weapons. It is consistent with what happens when large hailstones strike a person from above. Hail in the high Himalayas can reach the size of cricket balls during summer monsoon storms, capable of fracturing bone and killing on impact. A Garhwali folk song, transmitted orally for centuries, describes a king and queen punished by a goddess named Nanda Devi for offending her by bringing dancers and entertainers on a sacred pilgrimage. The goddess rained iron upon them. 3 theories now compete. Rai argues for repeat pilgrimage disasters across centuries, with the lake sitting on the route of the Nanda Devi Raj Jat, a 12-yearly Hindu pilgrimage. Harney argues at least the Mediterranean group represents an independent expedition lost in the Himalayas, with the cause of death simply coinciding with the same hailstorm hazard. A third, fringe interpretation proposes a forgotten medieval mercenary route connecting eastern Mediterranean populations to Himalayan trade networks. None of the theories explains why Mediterranean travelers were on a Hindu pilgrimage trail in the first place. Number 7. The Tollense Valley Battlefield. 1250 BC, northeastern Germany. 2 armies meet at a wooden bridge across a marshy lowland river. Within hours, thousands of men are dead. Their bodies will not be buried. They will sink into the silt of the Tollense Valley and remain there for 3,200 years. In 1996, an amateur archaeologist named Hans Dietrich Borgwart was walking the riverbank when he noticed a human humerus lying in the shallows. A flint arrowhead was lodged inside the bone. Detlef Janssen and Thomas Terberger of the University of Greifswald began the formal excavation, and the German Research Foundation joined the project as the scope expanded. Radiocarbon and dendrochronology dated the site to approximately 1250 BC, the Late Bronze Age. The team has so far recovered the remains of more than 140 individuals across roughly 450 meters of river floodplain. Extrapolating from current excavation density, the original combatant population is estimated at 4,000 to 6,000 warriors. For Bronze Age Europe, that number is unprecedented. The vast majority of the dead are young men, aged 18 to 30. There are virtually no women, no children, no elderly. Skeletal trauma includes blunt force fractures from wooden clubs, slicing wounds from bronze swords, and puncture wounds from bronze arrowheads and lances. One femur was found with a flint arrowhead embedded inside the bone, with healing tissue grown partially around it. The warrior had survived an earlier conflict, only to die in this one. Strontium and oxygen isotope analyses by Doris Dopfner and Thomas Tutkin of the University of Mainz revealed that the warriors came from at least 3 distinct geographic regions, including individuals raised in southern Germany, Central Europe, and possibly as far away as the Carpathian Basin. Until Tollense, the assumption had been that Bronze Age conflicts were small, local raids between neighboring villages. Tollense rewrote that. The warriors carried personal kits, small bronze tools, fish hooks, cylinders of birch bark, bronze rings tied in cloth that may represent the earliest evidence of military pay or trade currency. Standardized arrowhead types and identical clothing fibers recovered across distant parts of the battlefield indicate organized logistics. Horse bones with cut marks suggest the use of cavalry, which would make Tollense among the earliest evidence of mounted combat in Europe. Three theories now compete. The mainstream interpretation argues the conflict was over control of the river crossing, which sat on a major east-west trade route running towards Scandinavian amber and tin sources. Johnson has argued for a proto-state political consolidation conflict with two emerging power centers clashing at the dawn of European political organization. A more speculative reading frames the battle as a religious or eschatological war. The site is currently only 10% excavated. The full scale of Tollense will not be known for another 3 decades. Number 8. The Tarim Basin mummies. The Taklamakan Desert occupies the heart of what is now the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of Western China. Its name in the Uyghur language translates roughly to, "You go in and you don't come out." For 4,000 years, the desert has functioned as one of the most efficient natural mummification environments on Earth. Extreme aridity, salt-rich soil, and stable temperatures have preserved hundreds of bodies in conditions so complete that hair, skin, and clothing remain visible. The oldest mummies date from approximately 2000 BC to 1500 BC. They were first reported by European explorers including Sven Hedin and Aurel Stein in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Systematic excavation began under Wang Binghua of the Xinjiang Cultural Relics Bureau in the 1970s, and Western analysis was led primarily by Victor Mayer of the University of Pennsylvania. The mummies are physically striking. Many are tall, up to 1.85 meters. Their features are Caucasian-like. Their hair colors include blonde, red, and light brown. They wear woven woolen clothing in tartan-like patterns, including the oldest known examples of that weaving technique anywhere in the world. They wear felted hats with pointed crowns. They wear leather boots. They wear trousers, which are themselves among the oldest surviving examples of the garment. For 30 years, the standard interpretation, advanced by Mayer, was that the mummies were Indo-European migrants from Western Eurasia, possibly speakers of an early form of the now extinct Tocharian language, documented in the same region 2,000 years later. The interpretation was politically contentious in China, because any non-Chinese ancestry attribution complicated the historical claim of Han Chinese sovereignty over Xinjiang. In October 2021, a genome-wide ancient DNA study published in the journal Nature, led by Chungwon Zhang of Seoul National University and Yinkyu Chui of Jilin University, produced a result no one had predicted. The Tarim Basin mummies show no genetic connection to Western Eurasian populations. They are descended almost entirely from a deeply isolated population of ancient North Eurasians, hunter-gatherers who diverged from other modern human lineages roughly 25,000 years ago, and who survived in genetic isolation in Central Asia. The mummies are a genetic relic, the last known representatives of an ancestry that had vanished from the rest of the world by 10,000 BC. Despite that genetic isolation, they were culturally innovative. Cheese residues found on their chests, dated to approximately 1700 BC, are the oldest known examples of fermented dairy products anywhere. They had domesticated specific bacterial strains for dairy preservation. They were buried in wooden boats half buried in desert sand, with women given phallic grave markers and men given vulvar ones, an inversion of gender association unusual for any known Bronze Age culture. 3 theories now compete. Jing and Kui's view is that the Tarim mummies represent the last surviving ancient North Eurasian population. The traditional view defended by Mayer holds that the genetic finding reflects sample bias and that Indo-European admixture remains undetected. A third, fringe interpretation proposes that the Xiuhe Cemetery contains multiple unrelated populations conflated by site geography. Number 9. The Llullaillaco capacocha, children. At 22,110 feet on the summit of a volcano on the border between Argentina and Chile, 3 Inca children sit perfectly preserved in stone tombs cut into the volcanic gravel. They were placed there in the late 15th century. They have been frozen, undisturbed for approximately 500 years. They appear to be sleeping. The expedition that recovered them, led by Johann Reinhard of the National Geographic Society and Constanza Cerruti of the Universidad Católica de Salta, reached the summit of Volcan Llullaillaco in 1999. At 6,739 meters, it remains the highest archaeological site ever excavated. The 3 children are known as La Doncella, the Maiden, age 13, El Nino, age 7, and La Nina del Rayo, the Lightning Girl, age 6, named for a posthumous lightning strike that burned her clothing centuries after her death. Their preservation is unprecedented in archaeological history. Internal organs are intact, blood remains in the heart, hair is lustrous, individual eyelashes are visible. Forensic analysis confirms they are not artificially mummified. The combination of extreme cold, low atmospheric pressure, and dry mountain air flash froze them and prevented all bacterial decay. The cultural context is the Inca capacocha sacrifice, a major state ritual reserved for moments of imperial significance. Spanish chronicler accounts describe capacocha events tied to the coronation of a new Sapa Inca, to the death of the previous one, to famines, to earthquakes. Children selected for capacocha had to be physically perfect, of high social rank, and ritually pure. Hair analysis by Andrew Wilson of the University of Bradford, published in 2013, revealed that the Llullaillaco children had been deliberately fattened on a diet of maize and llama meat in the year before their deaths, far richer than typical commoner diets. Hair toxicology showed escalating doses of coca leaf and chicha maize beer in the months leading up to the sacrifice. La Doncella was found with a wad of chewed coca leaves still tucked between her cheek and gums. The forensic evidence indicates the children were not violently killed. They were placed in their stone tombs alive, drugged into unconsciousness, and died of hypothermia and altitude sickness within a few hours. Isotope analysis showed the children had been transported to Llullaillaco from at least 1,500 kilometers away, likely starting their journey from Cusco itself. The final climb of more than 4,000 meters of elevation occurred over approximately 10 days. 3 theories now compete. Reinhard and Cerruti argue for the orthodox capacocha cosmology, with the children representing direct offerings to mountain deities called apus. Wilson argues the ritual served as imperial political theater, masking state authority in religious framing. A more speculative interpretation reads the late period sacrifices as a desperate response to early rumors of European pathogens reaching South America before Pizarro's invasion. Number 10. The Pompeii body casts. On the morning of August the 24th in the year 79 AD, the volcanic plume above Mount Vesuvius rose 33 kilometers into the sky. Most of Pompeii's 12,000 residents fled within the first 18 hours. Roughly 1,500 to 2,000 did not. The technique that preserved their final moments was developed in 1863 by Giuseppe Fiorelli, the director of excavations at Pompeii. Fiorelli noticed that bodies buried in volcanic ash had decomposed inside the hardened tephra, leaving body-shaped voids. His method was simple: drill a small hole into the void. Pour liquid plaster of Paris inside, allow it to set, then carefully chip away the surrounding ash. The result was a perfect cast of the body in its moment of death, including facial expressions, hair, and the folds of clothing. Approximately 100 plaster casts have been made over the past 160 years. More than 1,000 additional skeletal sets remain unprocessed. Modern forensic analysis, led by Pier Paolo Petrone of the University of Naples Federico II, has overturned the long-held assumption that the residents died of suffocation. They did not. They died from a pyroclastic surge, a cloud of superheated gas and ash that traveled at hurricane speeds and reached temperatures of 250 degrees Celsius. Soft tissue was instantly vaporized. Death came in fractions of a second. A 2018 study by Petrone discovered black, glassy material inside the skulls of victims at neighboring Herculaneum. The temperatures had been so high that brain matter had been vitrified into a solid, obsidian-like glass. The Garden of the Fugitives cast group shows 13 victims dying together in a vineyard outside the city walls, including children clinging to adults as the surge struck. The Lady of Aplantis was wearing 2 gold bracelets, gold rings, and a fine gold chain. She died trying to flee with her wealth. In 2024, DNA analysis by a team led by Antonio Lanciotti and David Caramelli of the University of Florence overturned a 200-year-old emotional narrative. A cast long believed to depict a mother sheltering her child was confirmed instead to be an unrelated man holding a male infant. The famous master and his slave cast was likewise revealed to be 2 genetically unrelated males, with the older man bearing a spinal disease consistent with chronic disability. 3 theories now compete. The mainstream interpretation, advanced by Petrone, frames the deaths as instant pyroclastic shock. The older view, derived from Pliny the Younger's eyewitness account, frames them as suffocation by ash inhalation. A more speculative third position holds that the eruption itself should be redated from August to October, based on harvest evidence preserved in the casts. Recent isotopic studies of victim teeth show that nearly 30% of the dead were not Pompeii residents at all. They were travelers, merchants, and refugees from neighboring towns who had fled toward Pompeii expecting safety. 10 sites, 10 cultures, 10 distinct mechanisms of death and preservation. And yet, when the patterns are laid side by side, a single thread connects all of them. Every find involves a moment when a culture deliberately or violently broke its own ordinary rules around life, death, or burial. At Cladh Hallan, the rule that ancestors should be buried whole was suspended. At Herxheim, the rule that the dead should be allowed to rest. At Pampa la Cruz, the rule that children should be protected. At the Templo Mayor, the rule that the bodies of the killed should be returned to their families. At the Egyptian court, the rule that even disgraced royalty should be granted a path to the afterlife was deliberately violated. At Roopkund, no rule was broken at all, but the survivors processed the disaster through a religious framework that imposed meaning on natural catastrophe. At Tollense, the rule that combat was small and local was discarded. At the Tarim Basin, the rule that genetic isolation should preclude cultural innovation was inverted. At Llullaillaco, the rule that the strongest and purest should live was made the basis for selecting who would die. At Pompeii, the volcano broke every rule at once. The deeper pattern is that almost every site sits at a moment of severe environmental, demographic, or political stress. The linear pottery culture collapsed within 2 generations of Herxheim. A super El Niño flooded the Ushimu coast in the year of Pampa la Cruz. The late Bronze Age climate downturn coincides with Tollense. The Templo Mayor's late period skulls overlap with the first Coccoliths epidemics. The historian Eric Klein's research on the 1177 BC collapse demonstrates that crisis intensifies religious practice rather than abandoning it. Comparative anthropology now treats extreme ritual response as the predictable consequence of cosmologies pressed to their breaking point. The deeper terror is not that these acts were committed by aliens. The deeper terror is that they were committed by people whose worldview, taken on its own terms, made these acts the rational and necessary response to catastrophe. The people who killed the children of Pampa la Cruz believed they were saving their world. Preservation is the precondition of every find. Without it, none of these sites would exist as evidence. The mechanisms vary site by site. At Cladh Hallan, the anoxic chemistry of peat halted bacterial decay long enough for deliberate human curation to take over. At Herxheim, the alkaline loess soil and the relatively dry climate of the Central European uplands kept the bone fragments stable. At Pampa la Cruz, the hyper-arid Pacific coast of Peru, where rainfall averages less than 15 millimeters per year, prevented organic decay almost entirely. At the Egyptian royal cache, the combination of natron salt and the desiccating dryness of the Theban necropolis preserved soft tissue across 3 millennia. At the Templo Mayor, the volcanic stone construction and the overburden of colonial era and modern Mexico City protected the structure from the weathering that would have destroyed it within a few centuries on the surface. At Roopkund, the glacial freeze cycles repeatedly entombed and re-exposed the remains, allowing the discovery itself. At Tollense, the marshanoxia and silt encasement preserved the bone, and the very absence of formal burial may have contributed to the integrity of the assemblage. At the Tarim Basin, the salt-rich soil and extreme aridity preserved soft tissue, hair, and woven cloth at conditions found nowhere else. At Llullaillaco, the cryopreservation effect of altitude and cold was so complete that blood remained in the heart. At Pompeii, the pyroclastic flow itself created the body voids that Fiorelli's plaster casts would later fill. The implication is uncomfortable. Most ancient bodies vanish without trace. The horrors of the past survive better than ordinary deaths because they tend to occur in environments that also happen to preserve. History is, to a significant degree, written by what does not decay. For every Herxheim, hundreds of similar sites have been silently lost to ordinary geology. The archaeology of horror is not, in fact, the archaeology of the past. It is the archaeology of the rare and accidental conditions under which the past can still be read. Almost every site discussed here has been radically reinterpreted within the last 15 years, and the cause is the same in every case: a revolution in forensic technology. Ancient DNA sequencing has fallen in cost from hundreds of thousands of dollars per genome to a few hundred. The result has been a wave of papers that have rewritten received understanding. Terry Brown's 2012 study transformed Cladh Hallan from a curious mummy site into the founding evidence for British Bronze Age curated remains. Niraj Rathi and Itawan Harney's 2019 Roopkund paper turned a single-event mystery into a multi-population enigma. Chungwon Jong and Yinkyu Kui's 2021 Tarim Basin paper overturned 3 decades of Indo-European migration theory in a single publication. Sahar Salim's CT analysis of unknown man E confirmed his identity, and her parallel work on Ramesses III confirmed the assassination. Andrew Wilson's hair toxicology at Llullaillaco revealed the year-long fattening and drug regimen that no archaeological technique could otherwise have detected. The 2018 Herculaneum study by Petrone and his team identified vitrified brain matter, a finding that rewrote the temperature profile of the 79 AD eruption. The 2024 Pompeii DNA study by Lantiotti and Carmelli forced a reinterpretation of casts that had carried emotional narratives for 2 centuries. The pattern is consistent. Every established archaeological interpretation is provisional. The ongoing IRH and Max Planck collaboration on the Templo Mayor skull demographics is expected to produce another major reinterpretation within the next 5 years. Strontium isotope analysis, dental microwear analysis, ancient protein recovery, and microbiome reconstruction are all approaching maturity. Within a decade, the bone-based interpretation of any of these sites will look as outdated as the suffocation hypothesis of Pompeii. For all that has been learned, the unresolved questions across these 10 sites are at least as interesting as the answers. Who were the Eastern Mediterranean travelers at Roopkund? No historical record places Greeks or Cretans on a Hindu pilgrimage trail in the 18th century, and no plausible mercenary or trade route hypothesis has accumulated supporting evidence. How did the Tarim Basin population maintain 25,000 years of genetic isolation while simultaneously adopting Bronze Age dairy fermentation, woolen tartan textile weaving, and millet agriculture? Why did the linear pottery culture collapse so completely within 2 generations of Herxheim with no clear successor culture? What happened to Queen T, the principal organizer of the Egyptian harem conspiracy? Her fate is unrecorded, and no mummy has ever been definitively identified as hers. What specific event in the year 1450 AD justified the killing of more than 260 children at Pampa la Cruz? Sediment evidence indicates a major El Nino flood, but the precise political or religious decision-making process remains opaque. Which 2 coalitions fought at Tollense, and which side won? Neither group has been identified. How many additional composite mummies remain unrecognized in British museum collections, awaiting DNA analysis that no one has yet thought to perform? Were there higher altitude capacocha sites yet undiscovered above 22,000 feet? And most fundamentally, how representative are these 10 sites of the broader past? Most of every site discussed remains buried. Tollense alone is projected to require another 30 to 40 years of excavation. The ratio of what we know to what we do not know, even at the best investigated sites, remains heavily weighted toward ignorance. Archaeology, in the end, is not a discipline of completed answers. It is a discipline of refined questions. What archaeology actually reveals is not horror in any sensational sense. It is verified evidence of how human beings have lived and died at the edge of meaning, ritual, violence, and survival. The disturbing power of these 10 sites is precisely their reality. Cladh Hallan is not folklore. The skull tower of Tenochtitlan is not a colonial myth. The footprints of the Pampa la Cruz children are physically present in dried clay, photographable, datable, and verifiable. The forensic detective work of modern archaeology has stripped away the comfortable distance that older histories used to maintain. The dead at these sites are not primitives or monsters. They are people. The named researchers who have spent careers excavating, sequencing, scanning, and interpreting. These remains have done so with care, with rigor, and with the understanding that the bodies themselves deserve respect. Mike Parker Pearson's 3 decades at Cladh Hallan, Andrea Z. Blance's 8 years at Herxheim, Gabriel Prieto's continuing work at Pampa la Cruz, Sahar Salim's CT scans of the Egyptian royal cache, Raul Barrera Rodriguez and Lorena Vasquez Valin at the Templo Mayor, Niraj Rai, and Itawan Harney at Roopkund, Detlef Janssen and Thomas Terberger at Tollense, Chungwon Jong and Yingqiu Kui at the Tarim Basin, Johann Reinhard and Constanza Caruti at Llullaillaco, and Pier Paolo Petroni at Pompeii. Each of them has, in their way, given voice to the dead. The paradox is that the more we learn, the stranger the past becomes. The cosmologies that produced these sites were not abstract. They produced bodies, footprints, mortared skulls, frozen children, vitrified brains. And whatever cosmology a future civilization applies to our own remains, they will read us by the same forensic methods and ask the same questions. What rules did they break? What did they believe? What were they afraid of? Somewhere, right now, the next pyroclastic surge is gathering, the next ritual is being performed, the next find is waiting under a meter of soil. The past is not safe, and that is its gift.